Okay? The Byzantines control Ravenna, they control Rome, they control Naples, but the countryside is increasingly under Lombard control. One other result of this is that the Pope at Rome, at this point, basically is the Bishop of Rome. He assumes more responsibility for the defense of Italy. And sometimes he does this by raising his own armies, sometimes he does this by buying people off or by engaging in diplomacy. Regardless, the Pope is becoming a major power. At any rate, to conclude the part about Justinian, Gelimer is brought back as a prisoner to Constantinople. And Justinian holds a triumph. This is an ancient Roman practice which had been discontinued over the last century, but it allows Belisarius this great big honor. Okay? And the interesting thing is that Belisarius, being kind of a humble guy, does not ride in a chariot or a horse, he just walks on foot. And he's followed by Gelimer, okay, as their prisoner. And supposedly, Gelimer, as he was being paraded down the main street of Constantinople, muttered the words, "Vanity of vanity, all is vanity." Okay? That this is one big show. Sooner or later, it's all going to come down. Justinian was pretty merciful about it, this guy. What he did was, he gave him control of the state to shut him up and keep him on his side. And the Vandal warriors, for the most part, were resettled in the Far East so they could use their military skills to fight the Byzantines' enemies on the other side of the Mediterranean. And this was a policy they had there. You resettle warrior peoples once you got them under control somewhere else, let them do the fighting for you, let them get integrated into your system. Okay. As for Belisarius was imprisoned briefly by Justinian because Justinian suspected him of wanting to launch a coup. Now the story goes that Justinian had Belisarius blinded, and Belisarius spent his final days wandering the empire as a beggar. Actually, the story turns out to be false. He actually was reinstated, given a big estate, and said, "Thank you very much for your service. Here's your gold watch. Now, we're going to go on running the empire." Okay. Well, it might seem that the empire was in really good condition. In 610, Heraclius becomes emperor. Now, what had happened between Justinian's time and Heraclius' time was that essentially you had an emperor who was kind of a psychopath. Okay? And he was going around basically executing a lot of people who hadn't done anything, and he was making all sorts of deals. And it got to the stage where the empire was really being totally corrupted. Meantime, the Persians in the east decided it was time to invade. Now, the Persians, these are referred to as the Sassanid Persians, to distinguish them from the earlier Persians of the classical Greek era. Okay? And they decided we're going to reestablish the ancient Persian Empire, which means we're going to control everything from Greece, Egypt, eastwards. All right? So they invade, and they actually defeat the Byzantine armies in the east. Okay, and again, a lot of this goes back to the malfeasance of the emperors at the time. So Heraclius and his father launch a coup, and they take over the empire. Okay? And Heraclius proves to be a very good leader. He restores the military efficiency. He also engages the Persians in a series of battles. An interesting thing is at this time, Heraclius decides to change the title of his job. It used to be Augustus, going back to 1st century BC with Augustus Caesar. He will now be known as the Basilios, which in Greek means royalty or king. So in other words, the emperor is now the king. Okay. All right, so you have the Great Persian War. The Persians get as far as the outskirts of Constantinople. They take over Egypt. And what Belisarius does, not Belisarius, Heraclius, what Heraclius does is that he launches a counter-invasion. He sails to the rear of the Persian army, marches inland, and then you have years and years of battles. Finally, Heraclius defeats the Persians in a great big battle in what's today Iraq. Okay. By this time, the Persian Empire is pretty much exhausted from all these decades of fighting. And so the Persian king is deposed, and he's replaced with a new king. And it's like, we just want peace because this is getting us nowhere. So Heraclius gets a peace treaty that works to Rome's favor. So it seems that Rome has triumphed, not just simply in the west with Belisarius and Narses, but now a century later in the east. As we will see, this situation does not last long. One of the things that happens, in order to get the troops fighting, the war becomes a war of Christians against non-Christians. In many ways, Christianity becomes this ideology which justifies the continued existence of the empire. The emperor represents all Christians everywhere, and therefore that's what we're fighting for. Okay. The emperor also increasingly becomes involved in making religious decisions. And the empire starts moving towards becoming a theocracy. A lot of importance is attached to icons, or items of religious worship. One of the things that was really important was called the true cross, the cross that Jesus was supposedly crucified on. And it had been kept in Jerusalem, and the Persians captured the city, they took it back with them, and then as part of the peace treaty, Heraclius got them to give it back. So when Heraclius returned to Constantinople, he had the true cross with him, so it seemed to prove divine intervention in his favor. An interesting story that arises at this time, and it goes back several centuries, is this legend of an emperor who would fight the forces of the Antichrist. And there would be some big, huge apocalyptic battle at Jerusalem. And then the emperor would win and restore Christianity to the world. And a lot of people are starting to think, well, maybe this is what Heraclius is really about. Okay. So all these religious legends start coming in and reinforce the whole situation. Okay. However, there are other problems. And one of them is the conflict between Nicene Christianity and what's called monophysitism. Okay. Now, bear in mind, what I'm going to give you is a very simplified version. The actual version of this is so complex, they're still arguing about it today. Right? Okay. Basically, Nicene Christianity says there's a Trinity. Okay. Now, monophysitism was saying that, well, was Jesus a human and a divine being, or just one? Well, they went towards the idea he had a single nature, whereas the Nicene Christianity at the time said it was a dual nature. Okay. This caused an incredible amount of civil violence. The partisans of this thing took to the streets. Okay. There were bloodbaths, there were purges, there were assassinations over this thing. At the time, a lot of people were saying, well, wait a minute here. Isn't this just a matter of semantics? Well, if you said that, you'd throw out the third story window.
As Mark Twain said, they disagreed on a theological detail and took the matter to a higher court.
Well, that is true. That is true. At any rate, Heraclius tried to mediate this, going so far as to attend their services and trying to come up with a compromise. Basically said that the more you compromise, the more it will resolve to resist this. Now, the centers of monophysitism, what occurred today, was Egypt and Syria. Okay, the Nicene Creed was practiced more in Anatolia, in other words, what is today Turkey, the Balkans, Greece, and Italy, and North Africa. So this becomes a division, not simply over theology, but also about parts of the empire. Okay. Well, the story goes that after Heraclius defeated the Persians, a messenger appeared at his court. And the messenger said, I represent a desert leader by the name of Mohammed, and we want you to accept our religion. And if you do, we will have peace. If not, it's war. A similar messenger was sent to the king of Persia. And both Heraclius and the king of Persia said, oh, go away. Maybe they're wrong. What happened next was that Islam explodes out of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, to go into all the details of why this succeeded is an entirely separate lecture. Suffice it to say they defeat Heraclius and the Byzantine army in what's today Syria. They also go east, and they totally destroy the Persians. They conquer Persia. They keep going as far as India and Central Asia. In the west, the Muslims take Egypt, North Africa, and then take over Spain, which had been ruled by the Visigoths. Now, one of the reasons this happens is that when they get to Egypt, the Monophysites say, look, we can't stand the government of Constantinople. So why don't you Arabs come on in here with your Islam? You throw out the Constantinople government, and then you can move on and we'll have a Monophysite Egypt. I mean, essentially. I'm simplifying this all. 1,000 years of history, folks. Okay. So this is what happens. Basically, they open the gates of cities like Alexandria. When the Byzantines try to retake Egypt, they take the side of the Arabs. Okay, so Constantinople loses Egypt. At this point, essentially, the Monophysites said to the Arabs, okay, thank you, why don't you go away? It's like, no, we now have Egypt. What are you going to do about it? And so Egypt becomes part of the Islamic Caliphate. Okay, in other words, the Caliphate is the universal Islamic state at this time. In fact, it has remained part of the Islamic world, as you may know, to the present day. This has a lot of implications. Egypt had been one of the main grain sources for the empire. It also was a major source of wealth because trade went through it. Also, as you will notice, since Arab armies and navies now control the southern Mediterranean and Spain, the Mediterranean Sea becomes a big battleground. Constant piracy, raids, destruction. Cities like Massilia, today's Versailles, went from being these sort of super cities of the ancient world down to small fishing villages. Okay. Finally, the tide of Islam is stopped in the early 8th century AD at 3 different battles. In 717, an Islamic army is moving through Central Asia, and they run right into the Tang Chinese dynasty, which controls, at this time, essentially eastern Central Asia. And they fight this big, huge battle at this place called Aksu, which is in the middle of nowhere, and defeat the Arabs. And that essentially stops them. Okay? The other battle, 732 AD, is at Tours in France. Okay? And Charles Martel, who's leading the Frankish army, defeats an Islamic army there in France and throws them back across the Pyrenees. And the third big battle occurs in 1717 and 1718 in front of Constantinople, where again the Caliphate has armies trying to take Constantinople, and the emperor rallies not only his own troops, but he brings in allies from across the Danube River, and they wipe out the people who siege in Constantinople and throw them back. One of their advantages is called Greek fire. Okay, what this is essentially, it's like an early form of flamethrower, and you put this on a ship and you fire it at the enemy's fleet, and it causes the fleet to catch fire. So they have this sort of tactical nuclear weapon they could use. Okay, so at this point, they've stopped the Muslims, at least for now. All right. The problem is, by this point, the empire had lost a lot of territory. Essentially all of North Africa. Much of central Italy is now under the control of the Lombards. Also, there's a mass migration of Slavs from across the Danube to take over much of the Balkans and Greece, although actually some of them are vassals of the Byzantine Empire, so not quite a loss of territory. But a series of Roman emperors, Byzantine emperors at this point, decide we can't go along with the way that things have been going for the last several centuries. We've got a whole new situation. Okay, so they reorganize the empire. The basic political unit now is called the theme. The theme is essentially a very large province. Each theme is ruled by what's called a strategos, or general. He has 2 purposes. He's both the military commander and the civil commander. He's governor and general. The thematic troops are settled on land. Okay, the idea here is that, okay, since you own your own land, you've got a stake in the system, so you'll be fighting for it. Okay, also, it cut down on expenses because since you own your own land, well, you're a farmer, you have people working for you, so you've got income, so you've got time to, if you're mobilized, to go off to war. And they had worked out a very good system where each of these themes has its own little army, and then in time of war, it They could be mobilized and sent out to fight the enemy. There's also a central field army at Constantinople, which is called the Tagmata. Okay? So you have here this sort of two-tier system of thematic armies and tagmatic armies. But it proves to be very, very efficient. A lot of this went back, I think, the concepts of going as far back as Aristotle. The idea is you have to have a reasonable middle class to sustain your society. You have to have people who have a stake in society. You don't want to have the situation that developed in the late Roman Republic, where you had millions of people moving to cities, and then they're on the welfare rolls, and there are constant source of problems. This way, everybody sort of has a stake in society. Okay. So the Byzantine system is based on several pillars. One is a very efficient military. The cataphract cavalry are kept, but they also build up the infantry to deal with different kinds of threats. They write military manuals, and they're still in existence today. You can even get them off of the internet, you can go down to your library and dust off the copies. And the thing about these military manuals is that they describe each kind of enemy you face, and then what are the tactics. Different ways to fight caliphate. If you're fighting the Scythians, who are coming from the north, different from fighting the Lombards and Franks in the west. Okay, so the idea is a general will have this book and say, hey, this is what we should be doing. Good idea, you know. When in doubt, read the manual. If that doesn't work, turn off your computer and start it up again. Okay, diplomacy. Okay, diplomacy becomes a major factor. The idea here is that, look, if by establishing good relationships with people, or buying people off, or conducting espionage, we can gain our goals, let's do it. If we don't have manpower to spare, better to get our enemies on our side. Okay? As I noted, Constantinople was saved from the Caliphate siege by bringing in allies from the north. So again, you get your allies to do the fighting for you, you also reduce your own casualties. All right, trade. They control trade. Constantinople is the center of many different trade routes. So that means you have income, you have money, you have stuff to pay people with. And so they establish a cash economy. They collect so many taxes. Yeah, I know, libertarians' taxes. But they use that to pay the army, to pay the diplomatic service, to pay off their very allies. Okay. There's also a major effort to keep the currency stable. The major problem in the ancient world, and wouldn't happen today, right, was inflation. Okay? And what happened is they would do things like, well, okay, it's a gold coin, but put a little silver in it, just you know. And the same thing, they would sometimes just shave off part of it and, you know, use the shaved off parts to melt down and build new currencies. And it's like, that would cause the currency to inflate. No, what they did is say, we're putting a stop to that. And so Byzantine currency becomes accepted throughout the whole Mediterranean world and the Middle East. Okay, you want to make a payment to something, you get your Byzantine, you know, Bitcoin, so to speak. and so their economy becomes a foundation, essentially, for the economy of the rest of the world. And so there's reasons for other people to keep this thing stable. Okay? It's like, well, do we really want to bring down this system when it means like that pile of gold we have in our castle is going to be worth nothing? Nah. Okay. Also, another advantage is they'd often pay off enemy tribes that were trying to invade the empire with a bucket load of gold. Now, it would seem that this would be a drain on the economy. And what would happen? Well, these tribes would take the gold, and what were they going to do with it? Eat it? So they go back to Byzantine merchants and buy stuff. So in other words, essentially, by paying off barbarian tribes, they were stimulating their own economy and getting the barbarians to do their own fighting for them. So it's like a 2-for-1 there. Okay. Another major issue was maintaining the middle class thematic soldiers. Okay. The major problem was that you often had what were termed magnates, or local big men, who tried to buy up the land of small peasantry. Okay. Of course, in the short term that might work. In the long term, you couldn't have all these dispossessed people flooding into the cities, putting demand on the grain bill. So the emperor would frequently push through laws that said, okay, peasants are guaranteed their land, or if they lose it, they get to buy it back at a discount. All right. So essentially, they were maintaining the middle class. Again, I'm sure they pulled out some copy of Aristotle on politics and said, hey, They figured this thing out 1,000 years ago. Why don't we do it? You know, why don't we learn a lesson here? So this keeps the system stable. Monasticism is another major part. Okay, monasteries become centers for culture, for agriculture, for scientific development, new developments in artwork. So, and also, many of these monasteries are located in like fortified positions on hillsides, so they become de facto defensive positions, and the monks become big supporters of Constantinople. And you also have missionaries. Okay, they send missionaries for the Orthodox Church all over the place. In the 10th century, Vladimir of Kiev converts to Christianity. He's the Prince of Kiev, and since he's the prince, everybody else converts, or else. Okay, so what happens is essentially, with today, Western Russia gets integrated into the Orthodox world. And they become de facto allies of the Byzantines, mostly. Sometimes it's like, hey, we do a piracy, so. All right. So what's happened here is that they're expanding their cultural influence. Okay? Now, you would think at this point they've got the whole situation under control. They're going to continue doing what's work. Well, in the late 8th century, we have the rise of the Isaurian empires. Okay? Isauria is another name for Anatolia, or what's today Turkey. Okay? It had been a heartland of Christianity for centuries. Prior to that, it had been a heartland for Greek civilization way back in the era following Alexander the Great. So this is the stronghold of the Byzantine Empire. Okay? Well, what happens is that one of the emperors, Leo, the Isaurian, is on the offensive. He retakes territory loss from the Arabs. Okay. Oh, this is the Varangian Guard. These were Russian mercenaries who signed up to fight for Constantinople, and they were considered to be the most elite of the elite troops. And they fought all over the place, and they were known to be the toughest warriors at the time. And those were reenactors. Okay, they didn't have color photography back then, so that's another reenactor. But the Varangian Guard, it becomes one of the elite units of the empire. So at any rate, with all this system in place, you'd think they'd start winning. And then what happens is that Leo, the Isaurian, comes up with a brilliant idea. Since the Muslims don't believe in icons, we shouldn't believe in them either. So why don't we take down all the statues, the paintings, and everything else, and just destroy them. This way we will become stronger. At this point, the monks said, well, we like our icons. A lot of the old faithful said, we like our icons too. And Leo's attitude was, sorry, I've got this brilliant idea. Let's wreck all this stuff. Let's tear it all down. Let's melt it all down. Well, this leads to a near civil war in the empire. Okay? The military successes come to a halt so they can spend their time hunting down, depictions of various saints and whatnot. And so the empire is starting to halt in its tracks. Not only that, there's a situation with the Pope at Rome. And basically, up until this point, there's been this kind of de facto alliance between the Byzantines and the popes, because we're both Christians fighting the Muslims in the Mediterranean. Well, at this point, the Pope starts saying, wait a minute, are you guys nuts? We like our statues. You're not going to come over here and do this, are you? Because you still have a Byzantine presence in southern Italy. So what happens is that this does much to fracture the Christian world without gaining them. In 762, Irene becomes empress. She originally started off as the regent, and then after a lot of skullduggery and people being found with multiple stab wounds and being ruled as a suicide, she becomes empress, and essentially she ends the iconoclasm. She holds a church council, which among other things says, hey, it's okay to have icons. Okay. Another interesting thing with Irene is that she starts making alliances with the Franks in the West. At this time, the king of the Franks is a guy by the name of Karl, or Charlemagne. Okay, Charles the Great. You may have heard of him. Okay, and basically what Charlemagne has done is he united not only all the Franks in Germany and France, but he also has done a pretty good job of defeating the various peoples who are moving in from the east and devastating Europe. So he reestablishes the defenses of Europe somewhere in Central Europe. He also marches into northern Italy at the request of the Pope, defeats the Lombards, and makes northern Italy all the way down to Rome part of the Frankish Empire. Okay? So in 800, Charles or Karl comes to visit the Pope. It's Christmas Day, he kneels in Mass, and the Pope comes up with the crown and says, "I crown you Roman Emperor." And Charles said, "This wasn't on the agenda here. What is this?" But, you know, what are you going to do, give it back? So he is now technically Roman Emperor because the Pope has blessed him. And more practically, because he controls a sizable part of Europe. Now, this causes a lot of problems with Constantinople. And why does this cause a problem with Constantinople? Because the emperor is supposed to be at Constantinople. So this leads to further divisions between East and West. And there's Europe, 814. So you see the Franks are here, the Byzantines are here, and then you have various other people wandering around trying to establish states. And then the Caliphate is all the way here, all the way up to Spain. Okay. Well, in the 820s, the situation seems to be stabilizing in the Mediterranean. And then Euphemius, who's the commander of the Byzantine fleet in Sicily, has a great idea. He wants to become emperor under Basilios. And so he wants to lead his fleet and his men, take over Constantinople, and then declare himself top dog. Well, what happens here, of course, is that this is another civil war. However, Euphemius doesn't have the strength to do this. So what does he do? Brilliant idea. I'm going to call in the Arabs, and they're going to give me the troops and the ships. And together, we're going to take over the empire. Well, what happens, basically, is that once the Arabs show up in Sicily, they start taking over Sicily for themselves. And Euphemius tries to stop this. He says, wait, this wasn't what we agreed on. And again, as what happened with Egypt, the Arabs said, we're here, we've got boots on the ground, what are you going to do about it? So Euphemius flees, and he's last heard of somewhere in the eastern part of the empire, trying to find someone to be his attorney or something. But what happens as a result of this is that the Arabs take over Sicily. This is really bad because Sicily has been a major source of grain for the empire. Also, because of its position in the central Mediterranean, it controls the sea routes, and so the Byzantines are starting to lose naval control, which is very bad because their empire is connected by fleets. Okay. They make some attempts to retake it, but they never quite pan out. Okay, 846, a major action occurs near Rome. What happens is that with control of Sicily, the Arabs start conducting pirate raids into the Italian peninsula. In 846, they land an army, and they try to take Rome, pillage it, and go home. Now, at this point, the Pope told his troops, when the Arabs show up, take a knee, we'll put up a banner saying, welcome refugees, we'll let them take whatever they want. No, I'm just kidding. But what he actually did was he mobilized an army, okay? And his army is not just simply the papal troops. It's also Frankish troops from the north and Byzantine troops who are still in the south. Okay, and so they meet the Arabs in battle and wipe them out. This is the castle of St. Angelo. It's actually also known as Hadrian's tomb because presumably Hadrian is buried there. It's outside the city of Rome. But what this indicated to a lot of people is that, look, there's this big threat in the Mediterranean. Maybe one of these days we ought to deal with it instead of fighting each other. Brilliant concept. Okay, so the 900s, another Byzantine revival. This is under what's called the Macedonian dynasty. And This is Basil II. And basically building on the thematic armies, on the good economy, on the revival of religion, he's able to expand Byzantine territory. He takes land lost in Italy. He retakes parts of the Middle East. He gets as far as Antioch, which had been lost hundreds of years before. And so the empire is actually looking pretty good. And not only that, it's kind of compact. It's now concentrated here with Turkey, the Balkans, up to the Danube, which is the natural barrier, and southern Italy. And there are also plans to retake Sicily. However, Normans beat them to it. The Normans started off as Vikings who settled in northern France, and I think they're mostly known for taking over England in 1066 AD under William the Conqueror. However, they are some of the best soldiers in Europe, and they basically what happens is that they had some settlements in southern Italy, and they said, look, we'll deal with this Arab threat in Sicily. And so they basically take it over, and now it's part of the Norman kingdom of southern Italy. And an interesting thing is that the Normans actually are very eclectic. Their idea is that, hey, if someone can do a job, we don't care what your religion is. You're Orthodox, you're Christian, you're a Muslim, you get the job. They're very, very interesting. It's one of the reasons they kept winning, by the way, is because everybody decided, hey, we can get a better deal with the Normans than with the other people. Okay. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, things are starting to decline. By the year 1000, the army is starting to feel the economic pinch. So what they do is they demobilize much of the army and fleet, and the idea becomes, well, we're going to use mercenaries instead. The idea is that, okay, you hire mercenaries, you just have to pay them for one season. Also, since they're foreigners, it means we're not going to lose, citizens. Also, since these are people we might be fighting anyway, it's a good way to get rid of them by playing them off against other people. You also have more factions at court. Increasingly, people want to become emperor, because it's good to be emperor, right? For you and your family. So you have this constant state of backbiting and low-level civil war going on at Constantinople. And this leads us to 1071. All right, at this point, the Seljuk Turks come out of Central Asia. The Seljuk Turks are led by Alp Arslan, and he's their sultan. And he takes, basically what he does is he takes over what's today much of Central Asia, then today what's Iraq, Persia. And then his plan is he's going to advance south, he's going to take Jerusalem, from there take Alexandria, and to make himself the Sultan of the Islamic world. He's a Muslim. Okay? The problem is that even though his plan was to go south, a lot of the tribes he enlists decide, hey, well, as long as we're here, why don't we just start pillaging the Byzantine Empire? Because they're rich. Better to pillage them than going south and maybe get killed somewhere. And so what happens is that the Seljuk Turks start raiding into the eastern parts of the Byzantine Empire, what's today the Armenian frontier, okay, eastern Turkey. All right. So the Byzantine Emperor at this time is named Romanus Diogenes. He assembles an army to meet them and fight them. Now, what happens is that his army is composed mostly of mercenaries. He's got a solid corps of regular troops, including the Varangian Guard. But many of the troops are tribesmen who are related to the Turks. Many of them are mercenaries from the Frankish and Lombard kingdoms who are in it for the money and often have to be restrained from pillaging Byzantine territory. To make things worse is that the factions at court are making life pretty difficult. One of the things that happens is that a rival faction for the throne demands that one of its top dogs be made his second in command, essentially. It's very simplified. So what happens is that he takes this army that is not cohesive with a subordinate who's not necessarily loyal to him to fight the Turks. Okay? So he meets them at this town called Manzikert, today in eastern Turkey. The battle starts off good for the Byzantines. They push the Turks back. But they have to be careful because the standard tactic for the Turks was you fall back, and the enemy advances too far, You surround them, you ambush them, and you wipe them out. So the sun starts going down, and Romanus, the emperor, says, we better fall back to our camp. We can resume the battle tomorrow. So he gives an order for a gradual fallback. Well, his second in command, who's in charge of the reserve, says, this is our chance to get rid of this Romanus guy. Basically takes his part of the army and just heads to Constantinople, leaving Romanus and his half the army on the battlefield. Well, what happens to them? They get wiped out. Okay, Romanus is captured and brought before Alp Arslan. And Alp Arslan is a very generous conqueror. He says, you know, if it weren't for this betrayal, I would be your prisoner, not you mine. So Romanus makes a deal with Alp Arslan and says, I'll pay a ransom if you guys go away. So he goes back, and Alp Arslan says, yeah, that's fine, because I don't want to conquer the Byzantine Empire. I still want to fight those people down in Egypt and help control the caliphate. So Alp Arslan lets it go. Romanus goes back to Constantinople to find the city is being fought over by different factions. And what happens to Romanus? Well, one of the factions captures him, blinds him, and says, you're out of the picture. And so Romanus is gone. The Byzantine Empire starts self-destructing between factual infighting. Meanwhile, Turkish tribesmen are moving into central Anatolia, today's central Turkey, and carving out their own little kingdoms. As for Alp Arslan, the one guy who could have stopped this, the following year, he's campaigning in Central Asia. And he's conducting negotiations with somebody. And all of a sudden, an assassin comes forward with a bladed weapon to kill him. And Alp says, no problem, I'll deal with this. Give me my bow. So he gets his bow out, about to draw. A little too late. He gets stabbed to death. He's dead, so Alp Arslan's out of the picture. And suddenly, everything starts falling apart. The Turks now flood into central Anatolia. Okay? So the situation has gone from bad to worse to totally disastrous. The Turks finally do take Jerusalem, though. Okay? And that's as far as they get. All right. Well, in 1081 AD, Alexius Comnenus becomes emperor. He is a general. He's very efficient. He defeats everybody who goes up against him. And he reestablishes Byzantine power. And again, this is the history written by his daughter. Well worth reading. Okay. The problem he runs into is that they've lost all this territory in today's central Turkey. They still control the Balkans. They control a couple of pieces of Italy, some islands in the Mediterranean. Okay. So what happens is that he's got to now put the empire back together again. How could he do this? Well, he needs troops, but his best recruiting grounds are gone. They're now controlled by the Turks. Okay. So what he does is he sends a diplomat to the Pope at Rome and says, look, we need mercenaries, mobilize some people, send them east, help us fight the Turks. Okay? Well, Pope Urban II calls a consul at a place called Clermont in France. And he gets up there and he says, hey, here's a great idea. This is 1096. Here's a great idea. Why don't we Christians stop fighting each other and fight the common foe? And, wow, what an idea. And they agree. And so the leaders of the various Christian powers, including, what would we say, France, Britain, Germany, Sicily, and of course the Pope, decide they're going to form an army and retake the Holy Land. Okay? Now, what follows is 2 centuries known as the Crusades. Okay? And I don't want to go into all the details of the Crusades. However, there is a very strong element here of that by marching east, by accomplishing great things, we will spiritually purify ourselves. Okay? There's very interesting psychology behind this. Okay? So the whole thing here isn't simply to retake territory, it's to reclaim purity of Christianity. All right? Well, they show up at Constantinople a year later with the Crusader army. And Alexius says, wait a minute here. I just wanted a few thousand guys to supplement my army. Now you've got this whole mass movement out here. So what he does is he ferries them across the Bosphorus. And he says, Jerusalem's that way. We'll send you some guys. We'll give you some support. But, he sees a danger here because in the Middle Ages, a large army marching through your territory is going to take down every last, a head of cattle you got and trample your fields. So they basically said, Jerusalem's that way, go bother the Turks, not me. That's simplistic. Okay, so the Crusaders proved to be incredibly efficient. They defeat several Turkish armies along the way. Okay, and there's some interesting first-person accounts of how they did this, which are worth reading. A lot of good leadership, a lot of veteran soldiers, a lot of understanding of how tactics work. Okay, very, very interesting. So finally, in 1099, they get to Jerusalem. They storm Jerusalem. They take it. Now, a couple interesting things. One is, up until this point, the caliphate over in Egypt, the non-Turkish part of the Islamic world at this time, says, well, we don't really care. They're fighting the Turks. What do we care if they, but now suddenly it's like, wait a minute, if they're that close to us, maybe we ought to do something about this. So the caliphate now decides they're going to fight the Crusaders. And the Crusaders take them on and defeat them. A couple interesting things is that one, when they were in dire straits, the Crusaders needed something to boost the morale, so they suddenly find the true cross, which had supposedly had been lost hundreds of years, sometime after Heraclius. Okay? At the time, when they brought the true cross out, a lot of people were saying, oh, come on, this isn't the real true cross, is it? But the attitude was like, all right, look, we need some symbol, we need some icon. This is as good as anything else. Anybody got any complaints? No? Well, we'll use it. And so this becomes a very important religious symbol. Anyway, the First Crusade turns out to be a total victory. And they established what are called Crusader kingdoms. These are based on Antioch, Edessa, and Jerusalem. An interesting point is that Godfrey of Boulogne becomes king of Jerusalem, but he refuses to call himself king because only Christ can be king. He just sees himself as a Christ vicar on earth. And another interesting thing is this seems to fulfill the legend I earlier mentioned about Heraclius, of the king who defeats the enemy armies at Jerusalem and establishes the new kingdom. So what this means is that much of the spiritual impetus behind all this is being transferred away from Constantinople to Rome, okay, and to Christians in the West. There's Crusaders outside Jerusalem. Okay, well, to go into the next couple of centuries would keep us here till they're serving breakfast. But suffice it to say, the Byzantines progressively lose territory. They're no longer a major power. In 1204 AD, they essentially, the Fourth Crusade decides they're going to take Constantinople themselves and put a true Christian, as opposed to these Orthodox people, on the throne. They do this through treachery. Constantinople now becomes the center of what's called the Latin Empire. This lasts for a few decades, and then finally, some of the old Byzantine founders get together and they boot the Latin emperors out, and they reestablish an empire. But as you can see, it's a very small empire. It's essentially a piece of the Balkans, Western Turkey, and this little strip up here called Trebizond, which is semi-independent, called sometimes the Empire of Trebizond. Okay. So what's happened is they've gone from being a global empire to a strong regional empire to just being another small kingdom fighting for control of the Near East. Okay. Meanwhile, the themes have collapsed. Okay. The magnates now are completely in control. We have a form of feudalism emerging, where local strongmen recruit their own armies, where much of the form of middle class disappears. And so you've got essentially warlord armies struggling for control. Often it's to gain control of Constantinople, which is supposed to make you emperor, but not much of an empire. Okay, in the 1300s, the Ottomans appear. This is another branch of the Turkish people. The Seljuks had been pretty much destroyed when the Mongols invaded in the 1200s. Okay. For a while, actually, the Mongols had carved out a little kingdom in what's today Turkey, and then that was subsumed. And the Ottomans proved to be very effective. They have very good leadership. They have a very good military system. They're able to rally large numbers of people. So they increasingly could gain more and more control of what's today Turkey. They moved across the Black Sea into the Balkans, and they started setting up their own kingdom in what's today the Balkans. By now, Byzantine armies are mainly mercenaries or some feudal contingents. The old professional armies are long gone. The magnates have more and more control. The emperor is often put in a position of having to negotiate with his own subordinates just to keep his throne. So altogether, it's a bad situation. The Christian powers tried to stop the Ottomans. They call a couple more crusades in the 14th century, and these are defeated, again, because the Turks just happen to be better in the field. Okay, so by 1400, the Byzantine Empire is essentially a piece of territory around Constantinople, a piece of Crimea, the Empire of Trebizond, which is independent actually, and a piece of Greece. So, finally, in 1449, Constantine XI becomes emperor. He was a very good military leader, but he doesn't have much to work with. And now he's facing the fact that the Ottomans are looking to capture Constantinople and make it their own capital. So, okay, so the Ottomans are on the march, and Mehmet II, the Ottoman Sultan, decides he wants Constantinople. And one of the things he does is that he brings in great big artillery pieces, this is the beginning of the age of gunpowder, to batter down the great big walls of Constantinople. And so what ensues is the siege of Constantinople, one of the epic sieges of all history. And basically, the Ottomans surround the city by land and sea. Constantine attempts to defend the city, but there's very little in the way of resources. The population is down to about 50,000 people. He makes an appeal to the West. The Pope sends some supplies. Some Italian mercenaries show up. And the Italian mercenaries are led by Giovanni Giustiniani, which, as you can note, is the Italian version of the name Justinian, a nice piece of irony. And so what happens is that the Ottomans begin to bombard the walls. They have these great big cannons which batter the walls in pieces. The Byzantines and the mercenaries make a heroic stand. The walls are breached, but Justiniani leads his men, throws the Turks out of the city. This happens again and again and again, until finally, Justiniani is wounded. All right, and he's in bad shape, so he requests to be left from the battlefield. Okay, so his men pick him up and take him to a boat to sail him away. But the moment this happens, everybody panics. Okay, so the walls are abandoned. The Turks storm the walls. Constantine, seeing the whole situation is lost, gets out his sword, charges into the enemy, is never seen again. Presumably went down in flames. And so at the end of 1453, the Ottomans now control Constantinople. This is usually seen as the end of the Byzantine Empire. The Trebizond holds out for a few more years and they decide, well, we've had enough. And they go to the Ottomans too. An interesting legend arises is that Constantine is actually asleep under the city and one day will return to save his people. Very similar to the legends of Frederick Barbarossa, the German emperor, King Arthur, and there was a queen of Christian Georgia, one in the Caucasus, the same thing with Queen Tamara. So again, all related to the religious thing. Okay. So anyway, there is a map. I like the sound of the map. See, it shows how things are going. And so there's the Roman Empire. That's Justinian. This is around 800, and they resurge, and more resurgence, and then smaller and smaller, and then finally, all right. As an afterthought, the The Ottomans go on to conquer the Balkans, the Crimea, a sizable piece of southern Russia. They also expand as far west as what's today Morocco. They finally stopped in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna by a European army led by Jan Sobieski, including Germans, Poles, and everybody else, the papal troops. And the final footnote is that the first U.S. foreign war was a war against the Barbary pirates of North Africa. The Barbary pirates were Ottoman vassals, so that's kind of a nice end note. All right, so do we have any questions?
You might notice that sometimes people use the term, when they're talking about politics, they're very confused and use the term Byzantine.